Welcome, everyone. This is our latest meeting of the U.S. Integrated Reporting Community. Today, we're going to talk about the Conference Board Working Group report on the emergence of integrated reporting.
The Conference Board put together an integrated reporting working group, and this is the main output of this report. I think we met, it's in the document 5 or 6 times altogether. And really they were hearing a lot of trends about integrated reporting and also environmental, social, and governance reporting, ESG reporting. So I wanted to get a group of people together to talk about the current state of that type of reporting, in particular integrated reporting. And as you can see here, I think an important thing is outside the 4 corners of SEC filings. And we'll talk a little bit, and you know we have the example of Intel that's done it within their SEC filing, but a lot of these are, of course, outside of the 10K and come in all different types of form and variety. It could be a sustainability report, it could be an integrated report, mostly overseas for those matters. But really just getting the people together and just giving the state of play going on with integrated reporting, what they're seeing in this area of reporting.
Great, John.
So I would add that I was interested in this project from a broader perspective, which is really has to do with the emergence of ESG as an issue that all of us have suddenly recognized as being critical to companies. And it's interesting because this has emerged so quickly. We were just discussing some of the reasons why this has happened in recent years. It has to do with climate change. It has to do with the fact that the government has sort of absented itself from a lot of these issues that are of great concern to the public. It has to do with the emergence of a new generation of shareholders, millennials, who are very, very interested in these issues. And so the challenges to companies are changing, and the institutional investors as well as the companies have become aware of this and have moved on it very quickly. The most recent important event, I think, is the Business Roundtable's statement on the purpose of a corporation. There's been some skepticism about whether this is just a paper statement or whatever. I don't care. It's what that statement says that is important. And I think many companies are listening to that. It does represent a very significant change away from the old era of shareholder primacy that we've all lived through into an era in which we're looking at the broader impact of corporations on people, also in their own employees, the environmental, the social impact. We're starting to look at corporations for what they really are, which is hugely influential organizations and enterprises that have a very big impact on all of our lives. And it's high time that we recognize that. Integrated reporting lends itself to that view of a corporate enterprise and offers ways for corporations to explain themselves in ways that are quite customized. And I think as we live through really 3 decades of governance reforms that have been largely externally imposed on the corporation and that have been largely one size fits all, we're now, with integrated reporting, entering the stage in which corporations are going to be a little bit more the masters of their own fate in terms of describing in ways that they think are correct for their needs and for their stakeholders, what they're all about, and to tell their story. So I think it's a very important movement and one that is right for the times.
Great. So with that, I think we're going to jump in and go to the first section. There are some bullet points. We're obviously not going to be able to do the whole report justice. There's a great table in here about the different types of capital. But for our discussion of this section, which is the rationale for integrated reporting, I thought we'd just land on this diagram, which is an adaptation of one that's been around for quite a while in the IRC. And if you want to just jump in, Bob, and talk to us about the rationale for integrated reporting.
Yeah, and this was the main section I was responsible for, and we started off the section, and this is the definition that the working group had for integrated reporting is enhancing corporate reporting to more comprehensively explain how the company creates value in the short, medium, and long term through the eyes of management. And I think the key phrases are there, creates value over a time period through the eyes of management. And we're trying to point out in this section differences between integrated reporting, sustainability reporting, and that general term, and ESG reporting. In this, the rationale, I talked a lot about how things are changing, and many of you know the statistic. Way back in 1975, about 80% of a company's value would be explained by its balance sheet. That's lessened to, it's gone less than 20% now. And so trying to say that reporting needs to keep up with it, and how important human capital and intellectual capital are to the creation of value, especially over the long term. I really like what we came up with this pictorial, because many of you be familiar with what we call the octopus model from the IRC, which I think is kind of confusing to people because it's got on the left-hand side, as we do here, the 6 capitals, but also has on the right-hand side. And that confuses people, is that do you really need to focus specifically on the capitals, and what is your increase or decrease in capitals? And I think it gets people into more a financial reporting mindset, where I like this, where we talk about the 6 capitals and your business model. But really the left part of it is integrated changes, and talking about what we talk about as integrated thinking is really maybe one of the more important things about integrated reporting, is changing the way that communication occurs within a company and how you think about value, and not being so reliant on what you produce externally under FASB and SEC rules. And that was really the kind of thing we're trying to make in this area, and especially with this pictorial.
Great. John, you want to share your thoughts on the rationale for integrated reporting?
Yes. I think that one of the most important aspects of it is that it changes the internal workings of the company, if it's going to work. Often there's a discussion amongst those of us who are close to the integrated reporting movement that integrated thinking is what we're really interested in, and what has to precede integrated reporting. And so ultimately, a company may face some real challenges in terms of the way it has traditionally done things in response to external requirements, such as SEC requirements or whatever. To recognize that you're talking first to your own employees about how your business is run, and changing the culture of the company. You're getting more internal collaboration. I did an article last year, interview with an IR executive who, and we entitled it a communication clearinghouse, because the IR executive had taken charge of the process of coordinating with the Human Resources Department, the CSR executive, the Chief Financial Officer, even the directors and the CEO, in order to create an integrated message. And so we referred to that as a communication clearinghouse. But that's not the only model that can be used, but it's very important to recognize that you've got to get the whole team together in order for integrated reporting to happen. And some of the previous webcasts that have been done by this group, and I'm thinking particularly about Intel and travelers, we've seen how individuals at those companies have worked very, very hard with all the different areas and disciplines inside their companies to get them to collaborate, and how much they have listened also to their shareholders to find out what the shareholders think are material to the business of the company and what the shareholders want to know. So it's really a great exercise in looking at who you are as a company, what your real story is, and also what the people you are serving, all of your stakeholders, what their interests are and what their needs are, and coming up with a way of addressing all of those things together and collectively. So I think it's a great exercise, and in some respects, it's a whole new form of management.
That's a provocative statement to conclude. So. We have a few minutes for comments or questions about the rationale for integrated reporting. What are you seeing out there? Do you have any questions for Bob and John? Remember, you could just unmute yourself, or you can send something in the chat if you'd prefer.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
My name is James Rosenstein. I've often wondered whether, in other countries, in particular in Europe, it is a requirement to submit a sustainability report every year to the government, and things are integrated. I mean, countries like Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, and there are others as well. Do you think there is any chance that something like that could ever happen in the United States, for example, with the SEC? I doubt it. Personally, I doubt it.
Not with this administration.
No.
But in the future, maybe. I'm a great believer that the millennial generation thinks about these things very differently than my generation did. I also think that because of the urgency and the public interest in and understanding of the ways in which corporations affect our lives in so many different ways, other than just our stock portfolio, that perhaps with a different government or a different set of politicians in place, and maybe it's the younger generation who would do that, it could happen here. In Europe, of course, and other parts of the world, we've had a voluntary disclosure system from the start. They have a comply or explain approach to governance. Governance is voluntary, even though there are standards set by the EU. For example, even so, companies have a lot of range in how they explain things. So I've always thought that was a much more flexible model, and one that's easier for corporations to show their individuality. But we have a much stricter structure here in the U.S.
Yes.
Paul Thompson just chimed in on the chat. I don't know if, Paul, you can come on your audio or not, that there is a directive in the EU on reporting of non-financial information called NFRD, applicable to all companies with 500 or more employees.
Right.
We all get, especially those involved with us, get frustrated with how slow maybe progress will be. But I think there is some progress. It may be minimal. I wanted to make 2 points. And one of them was on the progress is that the SEC has just come out back in August with a rule proposal, and it may seem minor to many, but it's kind of a big deal for us in integrated reporting, where in a description of your business in the 10K, there's a proposal to talk about your human capital and talk about it more holistically. So previously, all you're really required to do was tell how many employees you had. And now, and I think this rule proposal will go through and kind of reflects Chairman Clayton's thoughts on the importance of human capital and intellectual capital, is going to be a requirement, I think, to talk about your human capital and how you judge your human capital, look at turnover. It could be your workforce competency, the training, and things like that. So I think that would be interesting. John, I'm not sure if you want to comment. I find this, even with the business roundtable, and some would say the shareholder, stakeholder perspective, looking at some of the current administration at the SEC, I think her name's Hester Peirce, if I got her name pronounced correctly. But she's a strong makes a strong argument from her perspective that if she looks at securities law, it is definitely shareholder primacy. And she looks at it a little bit different way. I'm not sure, John, if you have any comments on that and some of the speeches she's made.
Well, I don't think I agree with it, actually. And the lawyers that I've heard talk about this often have some very interesting views about what state law requires in terms of the fiduciary duty of the directors being to the corporation as opposed to just shareholders. But of course, the SEC rules were written to protect shareholders, and so we have our unusual mixture of state and federal law requirements. And of course, the U.S. Securities laws are structured to create adversarial relations between companies and shareholders. We have the shareholder proposal rule, Rule 14a8, amongst other things, and we have a long tradition of fight first, ask questions later. That's been changing with the emergence of an engagement, principally around executive comp plans. And I think that boards of directors and companies and their advisors have learned a lot from that engagement. They've learned that that you don't have to fight first with your shareholders or go to the mat with a legal challenge. That actually there's room for discussion, and there are a lot of shared interests and a lot in common. So I think that's changing.
That's great, John. I'm going to jump in and take us to our next section, which is about the critical elements of integrated reporting. And I'm going to skip over this a little and get us to, there's a great table that shows how a number of American companies are doing their reporting right now. So let's get back down there. Oh, in this section, I'm just going to tease you. There are a lot of great examples from, most of them are international, of different ways that companies are integrating their messages and pulling things together, talking about short and long-term different kinds of stakeholders. And there's some data here, as you can see, about what, length of report and that kind of thing. But while we talk about the critical elements of a report, I thought we could just land here on this table, not to talk specifically about every company, but what are some of the important elements of integrated reporting? So Bob, will let you start.
Yeah, I think the bullet, you don't need to go back there. I think this table is very helpful, but there's no one way to create an integrated report was one of the main bullets of this section. And it's kind of the thought process is that there's maybe frustration, confusion with all these models out there. And kind of the thought process was, maybe we'll get into this, I think we'll get into this a little bit more, is, well, pick and choose what works best for you. If it's a framework or some kind of standard of some kind. And I think that was the main report. This section focuses on the importance of describing your business model, how you engage your stakeholders, and then also.
Whoops.
Oh, we lost Bob.
We lost Bob.
He's frozen.
Yeah. John, maybe you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Well, because I think one of the reservations about integrated reporting in this country is concern that it will go beyond what disclosure requirements require. And therefore, there's a concern about increased liability and so forth. And what I think is interesting here is if you look at these different companies, you see that some of them have used their 10K. I think I mentioned earlier that Intel did its integrated reporting within its 10K and made some very big changes to the structure of the 10K while still preserving all of the materiality elements. And Travelers, which did not follow that format, which has a separate sustainability report on the website, they took from their 10K all of the material elements that were relevant to their sustainability report and put them there, but in a context which was fascinating because it really reveals the culture of the company. It puts emphasis on value drivers. And when you read that document, you really get to know the company. And I think even the employees of the company, when they read that document, get to know more about the company that they work for and can therefore relate themselves and their day job to this larger set of value drivers. And that's what integrated reporting is really trying to achieve, it seems to me. I know that there were some discussions about the title of the movement, the integrated reporting movement, and if they had to do it over again, they wouldn't choose the word reporting because that puts too much emphasis on the external aspect. So I think we need to recognize that there's a kind of holistic quality to this process, which is, and it's just as important what goes on inside the company to create the integrated report as the actual external reporting and process.
Great. I'm not sure, we still don't have Bob back, so I'm gonna.
You may have
there?
me.
Oh, good.
Sorry,
There we go.
What a great time for my internet to go down. Boy, man, oh man. Sorry about that. I apologize.
That's okay. So you were talking a little bit about the critical elements, Bob. Maybe we'll just open it to discussion unless there's any points that you just want to make right here, and then.
No, let's open it for discussion. Sorry,
Okay. That's okay. So anybody have any questions, comments about the critical elements here? I know the thing that, my focus has always been on the multi-capital model, Bob. And would you say that that's one of the most critical elements in your mind?
I think it is the critical element. I think we get caught up in what the report should look like or what the content elements of it should be. And I think that just thinking from the multi-capital approach, I think is the real way to go. We have our financial reporting out there. I think we have our sustainability reporting out there. I think that there's weakness in the human capital and intellectual capital area, especially in the intellectual capital area. I think human capital, kind of similar to my SEC comment, about starting to take off. But I think there needs to be the two things with that, with an overall focus of a multi-capital model, is begin the better integration of the financial reporting with ESG reporting, and then work on key performance indicators in the human capital and intellectual capital space, and then get that integrated. I think are the two main things that are needed. But overpinning all that is a multi-capital model.
Any other? Go ahead. Yes, please.
There's been a lot of talk among organizations that have created reporting systems like SASB and GRI and others, and some are trying to work together in order to get some kind of standard system that pretty much everybody can follow. What is the value of that, and do you think it's worth it?
I think it's, I can comment, I think it's worth it. I think there's a big public demand for these groups to work together. That said, I still feel, and this is just me talking, that organizations are looking out for themselves as organizations. And so the kind of working together, I would like to see it a little better in going through the grand scheme of things of what we're trying to accomplish. So I think it needs to be done. I think it will be forced by external pressure of people being frustrated with all these initiatives and maybe not seeing the groups work together more cooperatively. But it's something that needs to be done. I think the external pressures on groups such as mine will force us to cooperate better. But I'd like to see us do it better, quite honestly.
Yeah, got it.
I agree with that, and I think that there also should be a kind of warning, which is that if we don't come up with private sector solutions, then there's going to be regulation, and regulation is always too rigid. When you think about all these different companies in different industries, and you think of all the different elements that we're trying to include here, all the different sources of capital and the different value drivers, companies that are multinational, companies that are in extraction industries where there obviously are very direct climate issues versus consumer products companies where you have to think more deeply about the impact of their processes on climate. There's room for a lot of different metrics and standards here. It's huge, really. So the task of organizing all of this into a coherent way is a tough one. And how do you do that without regulators coming into play is an important question.
So, Bob, we have a quick question that well, it's not a quick question, but we'll try to make it quick before we move to the next one about on multi-capital accounting. I think it's William Russell asks, does the IRC feel the need to put financial values on other capitals to assess materiality?
I don't is my first reaction. There's a couple of thoughts in there, and I'm sure if Russell wants to, if Bill wants to comment, there's a materiality issue. There's been a lot of discussion. I want to go down the materiality rat hole. I think companies, being at like Microsoft, you kind of know what's important. You kind of know what you talk about on a day-to-day basis, and maybe lower mid-level people who are preparing these reports may not know about what's being talked about a lot, but I'm kind of suspect on guidance for materiality, and I think companies really know what's important and they know what they believe their story is internally, and it's just corresponding saying that externally. I don't think it's financial values that the question's a way of dollar amounts, but I think it could be in key performance indicators. So not sure if I'm answering that question the way it was asked, especially when I talk about materiality, but it doesn't need to be dollar terms in my mind, if that's the question. I think key performance indicators will help. And then it gets a little bit back to, I think maybe John touched on it or would like to touch on it, is this comparability issue. And we go down the route of integrated reporting, there may not be as much comparability, supposed comparability, as there is in financial reporting, but I think that's fine. It's companies telling their story.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump to the next section, which is about audiences. And let you, Bob and John, chime in about the issues around the audiences.
Yeah, and I'll do this real briefly, because I think this was one of the sections that John was heavily involved with, but it talks about the audience for integrated reporting, and it lays out three likely categories. The first is institutional investors and other security holders. And then there's the other external stakeholders. So it's kind of the shareholder perspective and the stakeholder perspective. And then the third one, which I think is one of the most important ones to me, is internal contributors and constituencies. And that's kind of the integrated thinking and having a real holistic thought process internally. So I think that's really important when talking about the audiences, and this section touches on each of those audiences and talks about them. But John, I know you're heavily involved, I believe, in this section, if you want to add some more on that.
Sure. Really not too much to add. I actually suggested that we add this section on audiences because I think that it's important if you're talking about a reporting process to always think about whom you are reporting to and who the audience is in order to make sure that you're telling your story in a way that will be understandable by those audiences. And subsequently, because this whole working group took place really last year, I would probably add millennials as a fourth audience, simply because my experience is that their attitudes are significantly different than earlier generations. They're much more deeply involved, starting with their education, really, and even grade school, with issues having to do with the environment and social issues and the kinds of things that we now associate a lot with politics, but that we're increasingly associating now with corporations. And so I would add them as an important audience, and particularly as they become more the owners of companies and working inside of companies, their influence will grow.
So, John, I'll ask you. You had shared a letter to your clients that your firm just recently released, and you talk about statement of purpose. And how do you think that connects into this topic with the audiences?
Well, actually, and that was sent out today. It's actually going on our website tomorrow. This is my
okay,
annual.
Sorry, I jumped again.
No, not at all. Thank you for the plug. I appreciate it. But I do write an annual client memo, and this year it's really. Oh, sorry, my phone is. I have to get rid of that. Sorry. I'm sorry, Mary, could you repeat the question again?
Purpose and
right.
audiences, yeah.
Right. As I said earlier, I think that the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of a corporation really changes the game a lot. It's kind of like a 180-degree change from the idea of a company being a profit machine and shareholder primacy being the main, the old Milton Friedman idea. And suddenly we're seeing the corporation as having a purpose that's much broader in terms of its impact on communities and stakeholders. And so I think that the idea of the audience, which is our topic right in this section, is very much expanded by that concept. And to have what has traditionally been a very conservative business group, CEOs of the largest companies in the US, recognizing that corporate purpose is meaningful in terms of the way they run their business, this then becomes also a part of the culture of the company as well. So companies have a heart and a soul as well as being profit machines, and I think that's a very profound change.
Any other comments, questions?
Sorry again here, another question.
All right.
I have been working for quite some time with an automotive supplier from Japan in the United States, and they're having trouble hiring people, especially millennials. And when they talk about their CSR activities, it turns them on. The millennials come. However, when it comes to actually volunteering, doing community work, and things like that, the millennials don't get involved. So they like the wording, but when it comes to actually doing something, planting trees and helping communities, education, and all that, they don't want to get involved. So any comments on that?
Well, I would say that the corporation itself can do things. I think back to a very well-known episode, Peggy Foran at Prudential had incentives of planting a tree when shareholders voted, or some other things like that. So I think that the corporation doesn't just have to sort of emphasize a pro bono individual employee activity. How about the corporation itself doing some broader activities?
Yeah.
My only comment, it's off base, maybe I shouldn't say this, but as parents of millennials, I think we have ourselves to blame with the everyone got a participation trophy. So it's just interesting the way different generations work, but I think we kind of shaped them as parents to that generation.
Right. All right, let's move on to the next section, which is debunking some of the myths around integrated reporting and surmounting challenges. Bob, you want to jump in?
Yeah, there's Mary. If you can go down a little bit, there's two really sections just on this page. You just want to go to, yeah, there's the myths here, and they're talked about there is, and the three are listed: lack of investor interest in integrated reporting. I remember I was recently in a meeting with Bob Hers, who was the former chairman of the FASB, who has always been a champion of this, and it's kind of all of us involved with it. Is we get the question of who's asking for this, and that's a valid comment, but I kind of go back to my days at Microsoft, where I think we learned is you just can't sit there and wait for someone to ask for something. If you think that there's a good idea that would really help, and this would help in the markets and all the things we're trying to accomplish. And so there's always that pushback. No one's asking for this, so why even bother with it? And then the other ones that are talked about here, I'll just mention them, is if we get stuck with a report, then people think about reporting standards and then, is this how the way an integrated report needs to be? And it's kind of my focus is getting off of the report and just talking about integrated reporting, and even maybe not even mentioning that term, but a multi-capital approach. I think it's real important. And then I think we're all of the same mind in this group that the current level reporting is insufficient. And I think statistics show it, that 20%, 80% deviation that I talked about. But there's some out there that say, hey, there's disclosure overload, there's too much reporting. So those are some of the myths. And then if we can go down to just the surmounting challenges, and I think just if you go through a few pages, internal challenges we have, and just go down a little bit more, and let you read the report when you look at it. But there's always the issue of legal risk, and I hear that a lot of times is why should we report anything more than we're required to report? And I'll personally think of it is that I at times think the legal risk may be overstated, and what you're missing is the opportunity of really telling your story. I think John, who's still there, maybe much more qualified to talk about that. And we had a good discussion when we had the travelers discussion about should you include this in your 10K or not, like Intel did. And so those are kind of the good discussions that we have. Let me just go, Mary, and we can come back to if John wants to comment on the legal risk. I've talked a little bit about materiality. There's buy-in and governance. I think this is really a tone at the top that to really get integrated reporting going, it's kind of at the board, senior executive level. And then just down below this is a discussion about the administrative burden. And people thinking, hey, we got all this stuff to do. Why should we have to do more? And then there's a discussion of internal challenges. So let me just stop there, just give you a brief overview of what's in that section.
So John, you want to take on the myths?
Sure. Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure I'm muted.
No, we got you. We got you. Yep.
Okay, good. Lack of investor interest is kind of an interesting topic, because I think sometimes companies are doing outreach to the wrong audience, and But lack of investor interest is also an issue for the institutional investors themselves. They have a big challenge here to organize themselves, and if you listen to Larry Fink and some of the others in the industry, they have said that they want their portfolio managers and analysts to start to factor these non-financial issues into their investment process, into their models. That's a challenge because a lot of these people are trained to think in terms of numbers, and many of these issues are hard to translate into numbers. But there's also the problem that sometimes companies are directing their communications solely at the portfolio managers and not at the stewardship teams or those groups within the institutions that are interested in these issues from a voting perspective. So there are a lot of logistics here, and it's still a work in progress, both on the institutional side and on the corporate side. So I think we will be making more progress. And obviously, the degree to which things can be standardized makes life easier for everybody, but you have to question whether that's really going to work to the degree that it has traditionally. Financial metrics are easy to standardize, as we know. But when you start to get into these customized stories about individual companies and their own KPIs and their own value drivers and sources of capital and how they fit together, you're working against a one-size-fits-all regime. And a one-size-fits-all is something people complain about a lot, but it does make their lives easier. So, you know, a compliance approach to things, someone's telling you what you need to do, you don't have to be as creative, and you don't have to take as much responsibility for as you do if you're really telling your own story. So I think integrated reporting requires a degree of courage and creativity, both on the part of corporations and the institutions, to figure out how to do this. And it starts with the company, and there's a quote from SASB, actually, which I will dig up if I can find it here, but SASB says that something to the effect that it's up to the company. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find this quote, but wait a minute. Here it is. SASB admits, quote, ultimately, companies decide what is financially material and what information should be disclosed, taking legal requirements into account. So that's not a one-size-fits-all statement. It leaves it up to the company to figure out what is material, what's meaningful, and then to get into that conversation with its audiences. So the era of one-size-fits-all that we've lived in for decades is maybe being changed in very fundamental ways.
Bill Russell chimes in that in a perfect world, we would have principles-based reporting processes, i.e. accounting principles and fewer prescriptive regulatory rules for how and what to report. So maybe the US will come to that someday. Right.
Well, that's the way it is in Europe, principles-based governance, certainly, yep. And that doesn't mean they do it well. There have been lots of complaints by the European Commission that companies, when they're doing a comply or explain exercise, really don't have very meaningful explanations. It's often, as here, sometimes it's legal boilerplate written by outside advisors rather than the company sort of really getting it down into the nitty-gritty. So there's still a long way to go, even in those principles-based systems.
That's a helpful observation. Thank you. So let's jump to this last section here about building trust and quality.
Yeah, and it's just about the assurance aspect. We had a couple of the big four accounting firms. PwC was kind of a co-lead of the group, and then also we had representatives from Deloitte, and they of course talked to their colleagues also at other firms, and just the issue of assurance or how to trust this information. And as we've discussed, some of it's pretty soft information. It's not like you have an accounting standard that says, this is the debit, this is the credit. I can go and double check how you actually did that. And it's, kind of through the eyes of management of how they're reporting, almost like it's been difficult to come up with any kind of attest standard for MD&A, although people have tried, a management discussion and analysis. So this is the discussion of building on that and maybe what kinds of different types of assurance could happen. But I think on top of all this is we're going to need some kind of assurance. I'm kind of the argument, let's get this integrated reporting movement going and then focus heavily on the assurance. But I can see where you need to talk about it at the same time. And that's kind of what this chapter talks about.
John?
Yeah, last year, I think in December of 2018, there was at the Oxford Union debate over whether or not SASB standards should be incorporated by the IASB and the FASB, and the result was, the answer was yes, that they should be. It's easier said than done, obviously, as Bob has just explained, but I've heard lots of companies complain that the SASB questionnaires are very difficult for them to answer, that the structure is one that they find doesn't necessarily fit very well with their the way they see their business. On the other hand, I think that SASB is very important because and very useful, and from what I know, they have been quite flexible in terms of the degree to which they have looked at different industries and tried very hard to come up with standards. Whether those should be adopted by regulators or by auditors is, I think, probably a premature question. I think we need more time working with standards and time for companies to look at the different standard setters and different metrics and figure out what works. We're in kind of a shakeout period, I think, now. There's so many different approaches and different metrics, but it should be that over time, some of these will start to be understood as being more meaningful, perhaps for different industries. I'm not sure how it's going to work out, but I think we shouldn't move too quickly to try and come up with a rigid way of applying these standards.
So we have a comment from Bill Russell. Assurance standards are needed because stakeholders can't trust the company's disclosures by themselves, too biased to their good elements. So that, I'm not sure, because there are two comments there. One is people can't trust it, but then too biased to their good elements would be that you're saying that reporting is incomplete, I think, Bill. So, I mean, do you, Bob and John, do you think trust in the underlying report is a big issue?
I do. I think this, for integrated reporting, if you're talking about an integrated report, I think the whole thing would fall apart if companies are just allowed to say what's so great about their company. So I think it's needed in all this type of reporting. There needs to be some kind of assurance or fact checking, if you will, and that it's a balance. One of the things we talk about in integrated reporting is a balanced kind of presentation. My only caution with that is there's so many things people can put up to say, I'm not going to do this. And one of them is, and I don't agree with this, but this is just the accountants trying to get more revenue by assuring something else. And then it's just another roadblock for people adopting things. So I think it's very important. It just needs to be sequenced properly. And I think a lot of this is just communication. And boy, I bat my head against the wall every day of thinking of how better communicate this, of what we're trying to do. Because I think it's for the person within a company, and especially those who do financial reporting, it's very difficult for them to grasp. And when it's difficult for them to grasp, I think they look at ways to argue against it. And that's just what we just need to be crisp in our description of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Got it. And Bill clarified that he's talking about if you're not disclosing negative issues and or you're not reporting against science-based targets. So we have just a few minutes left. I thought maybe it would be helpful to, if we go back to the beginning and just look at the kind of some of the table of contents again. Any final questions, comments from the audience, and then we'll let Bob and John wrap up.
Hi, Mary. It's Ken.
Hi, Ken. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks. It's been a while. I want to go back to that issue of myths and challenges. I know a number of years ago when we were working on intangible assets, the pushback we got was, why should I give my competitors this very strategic information? It was a competitiveness issue. And if I remember my history right, that was the same thing that happened a couple hundred years ago when companies were first required to disclose financial reports. It was kind of, why should I give my competitors all this financial data about myself? Bob, how are you approaching that obstacle? I know, a couple decades ago when we did benchmarking for manufacturing for key performance indicators, the idea was that your data would be anonymous and you'd volunteer it because you got something back in terms of where you stood versus everybody else. Is that, I'm not sure that is applicable here, but how are you dealing with that giving away strategic information pushback issue?
The way I try to do it is once I hear that is, well, can we talk about it? Let's have a debate. Let's just go a level lower. And of course, we don't want people giving away competitive secrets, but I think it's an excuse, in my opinion. The way I try to frame it is, shouldn't use a Microsoft example here, but I will. When you're trying to get intellect on what another company is doing, you go hire somebody from the company. And of course, they have a no disclosure agreement, but I think there could be some winking and nodding going on. And what I perceive as the level of sophistication of getting information of what's going on is much deeper out there than you'd ever report in what we're looking for of the area of intellectual capital. So I try to have a debate with people of, is that a really overriding concern? And of course, we don't want you to give any competitive information. I go back, and Ken, you said it. You even go back further when there was a first requirement of companies report revenue. The first argument that came out was, well, that will cause competitive harm, just giving my revenue number out. And so you hear it all the time, and I just ask people, let's debate it and let's talk about it a little bit more and see how convinced we are. And the last thing we want is to give competitive information, but I think you'd be a far way away from doing that based on what we're kind of expounding of people doing, versus all the detailed digging that goes on out in the day-to-day business world, in my opinion.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to let John maybe give some final comments, and then Bob let you wrap up.
Well, on this very important issue of trust and whether companies should exercise candor, it is a tough question, and there is a lot of pushback. I agree with what Bob just said, but I also think it's important to recognize that many of these non-financial issues are risk factors as well as they are value drivers. And a company is obligated legally to present an accurate picture, not a misleading picture of the health of the business, really. And that's what accountants are trying to do. And I think we've come round to the view now that the financial accounts taken alone and audit standards really do not now present a complete picture of the health of a company. And so I think companies have to think twice before they lean very heavily on all the things that they do right and ignore the things that they're not doing so well that are risk factors. These are material to an understanding of the picture. These are what any shareholder, the average shareholder, wants to know. So there's always that sort of legal standard out there to try to keep them honest.
Great point. That's really helpful. So we'll let Bob just wrap it up, and then we can talk about our next program.
Yeah, I was very happy with the way the conference board report came out. So I encourage you who haven't taken a look at it to read it. I think there's a chat question that came in. Maybe I thought we had posted it to our site, Mary, but maybe
it's in the invitation. It's in the text. There's a link, but I'll distribute it again when I distribute the announcement when I get the video up.
And I think how difficult sometimes I find explaining what it's all about. I think this report does it well, in my opinion. And so I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read it, to take some time with it and then share it with people. If people are confused, hey, there's this alphabet soup and what's this integrated reporting about? I think this is one of the best documents I've seen out there of trying to explain it in a better, more coherent standpoint.
Great. So thank you very much, Bob and John. I thought that was a great discussion, and thanks to everybody who participated. We always have great conversations here.